March 1945. Somewhere in the Rhineland. The air smells of wet canvas and disinfectant. Inside a converted schoolhouse near the collapsing Western Front, American field nurses move between rows of iron cots, their boots echoing against cracked tile floors. Outside, the thunder of artillery has finally stopped. The silence feels heavier than the shelling ever did. Spring rain taps against shattered windows, and in that strange quiet between war and peace, a young woman lies trembling beneath a thin olive blanket, her eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling. She wears the tattered remnants of a Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform. Her hands grip the blanket's edge so tightly her knuckles have gone white. When the American nurse approaches with scissors to cut away the soiled fabric around her thigh wound, the girl's voice breaks the silence not with a scream, but with a whisper that carries the weight of something far heavier than shrapnel. "Please, don't lift my skirt." The nurse pauses. She has heard many things in these makeshift hospitals, prayers in a dozen languages, curses, the names of mothers called out in delirium. But something in this plea is different. It carries not the fear of pain, but the fear of revelation. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing like a building whose foundation had been dynamited. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. On both the Eastern and Western fronts, millions of German soldiers were surrendering in numbers that overwhelmed Allied logistics. Prisoner of war compounds swelled beyond capacity. Farmhouses, schools, warehouses, anything with four walls became temporary holding facilities. And among the endless columns of exhausted, defeated Wehrmacht soldiers came a smaller, quieter stream of women. They wore uniforms too. Blitzmittel, they were called. Lightning girls. The women of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the Luftwaffe communications units, the flak batteries that defended German cities when there were no men left to do so. Hitler's regime had promised them glory serving the fatherland. In the end, it delivered them into captivity, hunger, and a particular species of shame that had no equivalent in the official narratives they'd been fed. American forces had expected to encounter female German military personnel. They had not expected the condition in which they would find them. The medical protocols were clear. Treat all prisoners humanely. Prioritize life-threatening injuries. Maintain proper documentation. First Lieutenant Margaret Whitmore, an Army nurse from Toledo, Ohio, had treated hundreds of wounded prisoners by March 1945. She had dressed burns, extracted shrapnel, held down screaming men during amputations performed without proper anesthesia. She thought she had seen everything war could do to the human body. When she knelt beside the young German auxiliary and gently tried to lift the blanket, the girl's hand shot out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Bit," she whispered again. "Please." Her eyes weren't focused on the nurse's face, but on something beyond her, something invisible and terrifying. Lieutenant Whitmore had been briefed on many things. She knew about mines disguised as children's toys. She knew about fanatic Hitler youth who might feign surrender and then detonate grenades. She knew about typhus and lice and the diseases that flourished in the collapse of sanitation. What she hadn't been briefed on was this, the particular paralysis that gripped young German women who had spent months not fearing American bombs but fearing the men in their own uniforms. The wound on the girl's thigh was real. Enough a shrapnel laceration from an artillery shell that had struck her unit's convoy 3 days earlier. But when the nurse finally, carefully, lifted the hem of the torn skirt, she found something else, bruises, not the purple-yellow marks of impact injuries, but the finger-shaped shadows of hands gripped too hard. Bruises on the inner thighs. Bruises around the hips. The kind of bruises that told a story no official Wehrmacht report would ever record. The girl was 19 years old. Her name was Greta Hoffmann, though it would be weeks before she spoke it aloud. She had joined the Reichsarbeitsdienst in 1943, when her two brothers had already fallen on the Eastern Front and her father had disappeared into the insatiable meat grinder of Stalingrad. The propaganda posters had shown beautiful young women in crisp uniforms, serving coffee to grateful soldiers, operating radios and typewriters, contributing to the sacred defense of the Heimat. They had shown strength, purpose, patriotic sacrifice. They had not shown what happened when the front collapsed and discipline dissolved, and the mythical invincibility of the Wehrmacht revealed itself to be a fiction written by men who would never be held accountable. By 1945, the German military was a hollowed shell. Its leadership was fractured, its supply lines severed, its ideological certainties shattered against the combined industrial might of nations it had underestimated. And in that collapse, in the chaos of retreat, certain protections evaporated. Official regulations forbade sexual assault within the military. Official regulations also forbade retreating, surrendering, or acknowledging that the war was lost. Reality had stopped obeying regulations sometime around Stalingrad. The stories emerged slowly, cautiously, in the days and weeks after capture. Not all the female prisoners spoke of it. Many never would. But enough whispered their truths to American nurses and female interrogators that a pattern became impossible to ignore. The enemy they had learned to fear most was not always the one firing shells from the opposite trench. Lieutenant Whitmore cleaned and dressed the shrapnel wound in silence. Her hands worked with the automatic precision of training, but her mind struggled with a dissonance that training had not prepared her for. She had been raised on stories of German brutality, the blitzkrieg across Europe, the concentration camps, the systematic machinery of conquest and murder. The enemy was supposed to be monolithic, unified in its evil. This trembling girl beneath her hands fit nowhere in that narrative. She was both perpetrator and victim, citizen of a regime that had unleashed unspeakable horror, and yet also a teenager who had been used and discarded by that same regime. The moral mathematics didn't balance. In the official records, these stories occupy a strange void. The Nuremberg trials would document atrocities on an industrial scale. Historians would spend decades analyzing the mechanisms of genocide, the logistics of invasion, the grand strategic failures of Hitler's military adventurism. But the smaller violence, the intimate brutality that happened in supply depots and field hospitals and temporary barracks during the retreat, this left fewer paper trails. It was documented in medical reports filed by Allied nurses, in the private letters of chaplains, in the testimony of women who spoke to American and British investigators but whose voices were often deemed less significant than the testimonies about gas chambers and firing squads. Lieutenant Whitmore wrote in her report, "Patient presents with shrapnel wound to left thigh, multiple contusions consistent with assault. Patient extremely agitated and resistant to examination. Psychological trauma evident." The language was clinical. It had to be. But that night, in a letter to her sister back in Ohio, she wrote something different. "Today I treated a girl who was terrified not of us, but of what we might discover. I keep thinking about what kind of hell she must have lived through, to be more afraid of a nurse with bandages than a soldier with a gun." The paradox was this. German women captured by American forces in 1945 expected brutality. They had been told stories about the savage Americans, about the barbaric treatment that awaited prisoners, about rapes and executions. These were the narratives fed to them by Reich propaganda, the same propaganda that had promised victory, that had promised Lebensraum, that had promised everything except the truth. So when they fell into American hands and found instead field hospitals with real medicine, tents with clean blankets, mess halls serving hot food, not abundant, not generous, but consistent, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Greta Hoffman, in the weeks after her capture, slowly began to speak. Not in formal interrogations, she knew nothing of military value, but in the quiet moments between medical checks, when the same nurse would sit beside her cot and simply wait. She spoke about the last months of the war, about the chaos of retreat, about officers who abandoned their posts and soldiers who had stopped caring about anything except survival. She spoke about the night her convoy was strafed by Allied fighters, and she had hidden in a ditch beside a burning truck, convinced she would die. She spoke about how relieved she felt when American soldiers finally found them, and then how guilty she felt for feeling that relief. "We were told you would kill us," she said in halting English learned from a dictionary years earlier. Or worse. "We were told many things." The nurse asked what she meant by worse. Greta looked down at her hands. The same things that were already happening. This was the hidden wound, not the shrapnel in her thigh, but the shattered expectation of protection. She had believed in something once. Not necessarily in Hitler, though the propaganda had been relentless, and when you are 14 years old and your world is circumscribed by radio, broadcasts and school teachers who wear party pins. Belief is not really a choice, it is the only atmosphere available to breathe. But she had believed in order, in structure, in the idea that the uniform meant something, that service meant something, that there were rules and they would be followed. By March 1945, she knew differently. American military command struggled with the question of female, German POWs in ways both practical and philosophical. The Geneva Convention stipulated treatment standards, but their framers had not anticipated the total mobilization of populations that characterized the Second World War. Were these women combatants? Some had operated anti-aircraft guns, their fingers on triggers that had brought down Allied bombers. Others had been clerks, nurses, radio operators. Where was the line? And did it matter when the regime they served had obliterated every other line of human decency? The decision was made, finally, on pragmatic grounds. They would be treated as prisoners of war, entitled to protection and basic care, held until their status could be properly adjudicated. In practice, this meant overcrowded facilities, limited resources stretched thinner, and the constant challenge of managing populations separated by language, ideology, and mutual incomprehension. But something unexpected happened in these spaces. The abundance, or what passed for abundance in spring 1945, became its own form of propaganda, more effective than any poster or radio broadcast. American field kitchens served meals made from supplies that arrived with mechanical regularity. The food was not gourmet. It was not even particularly good. But it was there. Every day. Beans and canned meat and dense bread and weak coffee. To German prisoners who had spent months on shrinking rations, who had watched their own supply lines crumble, who had scavenged from abandoned farms and traded cigarettes for turnips. This consistency was a revelation. Greta remembered her first meal in American custody. It was served on a metal tray, portions measured with utilitarian precision. She had expected starvation rations, punishment, cruelty. Instead, there was food. Enough food. She ate slowly, waiting for someone to snatch the tray away, to reveal it as a trick. No one did. The next day, there was food again. And the next. The abundance was not generous, it was merely adequate, but adequacy itself seemed miraculous. One of the recurring objects in her memory became the tin cup. Standard issue, dented, stamped with U.S. military markings. Every morning it was filled with coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute or chicory blend that had become standard in Germany by 1944. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm. But its existence testified to something she was only beginning to understand. The Americans had so much that they could give prisoners real coffee. Not as charity. Not as propaganda. Simply as a matter of course, because their supply chains functioned. Because their industrial capacity was so vast that even the waste products of their abundance exceeded what the Reich could provide its own citizens. She would hold that tin cup in both hands, feeling its warmth, and think about the promises she had been told. Germany was supposed to be the master race, destined to rule, inherently superior. These were the bedrock claims of the ideology she had grown up under. And yet here she sat, a prisoner, drinking coffee provided by the enemy, who were supposed to be inferior, degenerate, weak. The evidence in her hands contradicted everything she had been taught. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Like a bone healing badly that must be broken again to set properly. The American nurses were not naive. They understood that humanitarian treatment served strategic purposes. Healthy prisoners caused fewer problems. Cooperative prisoners provided better intelligence. Decent conditions undermined enemy morale. But understanding the strategic calculus didn't diminish the human moments. Lieutenant Whitmore, changing the dressing on Greta's wound for the 5th time, asked if the girl had family she wanted to contact. Greta shook her head. Her brothers were dead. Her father was dead, or might as well be. Her mother was in a city that might not exist anymore. The addresses kept changing as borders shifted and armies rolled over towns that became rubble. Then who do you have? The nurse asked. Greta looked at her with an expression that was ancient despite her 19 years. Nobody, she said. We all have nobody now. This was the Great Leveling. War had stripped away the myths and left only biology hunger, injury, exhaustion, the basic needs that transcended ideology. In the POW camps, German soldiers and auxiliaries learned a lesson their leaders never intended, that the Americans they had been taught to despise treated them better than their own officers had in those final desperate months. This truth was dangerous. It implied questions that undermined everything. If the Americans, the supposed plutocratic weaklings led by mongrels and Jews, they could organize logistics this effectively, could feed prisoners this consistently, could maintain medical care and supply chains, while simultaneously advancing on two fronts, what did that say about German superiority? What did it say about the entire edifice of racial hierarchy and Lebensraum and manifest destiny? These questions surfaced in the long hours of imprisonment. They surfaced in conversations conducted in whispers, in the dark corners of crowded barracks where women who had worn the same uniform shared the same disillusionment. Some rejected the questions, clung harder to the old certainties, insisted that Germany had been betrayed by weak leadership or saboteurs or Jews or any of the convenient scapegoats that ideology provides. But others, like Greta, sat with the discomfort and let it reshape them. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead in his bunker. The Reich he promised would last 1,000 years had survived 12 and was now being divided among the victors. In the POW compounds, the news arrived with a strange, muted quality. There was no celebration among the prisoners, but neither was there the despair that might have been expected. Instead, a kind of exhausted relief. It was over. The machinery of death had finally ground to a halt. Greta's wound healed. The shrapnel scar would remain, a puckered line along her thigh that would fade to white over the years. The other wounds, the ones Lieutenant Whitmore had documented as multiple contusions consistent with assault, those faded too, at least visibly. The deeper wounds, the ones that lived in flinches and nightmares, and the permanent recalibration of trust, those would take longer. Some would never heal completely. She was processed, documented, interrogated briefly by officers who determined she had no significant intelligence value. She was given papers and release orders and the address of a displaced person's camp in the British zone where she might find her mother if her mother was still alive. Before she left, Lieutenant Whitmore found her standing near the compound gate, holding a small bundle of clothes and the same tin cup she had drunk from every morning for 2 months. "You're supposed to leave that," the nurse said, gesturing to the cup. Greta looked down at it. "I know," she said. "I will. I just..." She trailed off, unable to articulate what the object represented. It was just a cup. It was also evidence. Proof that the things she had been told were lies. That the world was more complicated than the certainties of ideology. That sometimes the enemy showed you more humanity than your own side had. She set the cup down on the gatepost and walked away. Lieutenant Whitmore watched her go. This girl-woman who had been enemy and patient, and something more complicated than either term could capture. She thought about the hidden wound, the bruises that told a story the official histories would likely omit. She thought about what it meant that the greatest fear this German soldier had faced wasn't artillery or bombers or the advancing Allied armies, but the men in her own uniform. And she thought about the strange, brutal education that war provided, that sometimes you only learned the value of human decency when it came from the people you'd been taught to hate. The tin cup sat on the gatepost for 3 days before someone took it for reuse. It was just a cup. But objects carry meaning beyond their material substance. That cup represented something that no Nuremberg trial would fully articulate. No strategic bombing survey would quantify. No official history would adequately document the power of basic human treatment to undermine totalitarian certainty. Food provided consistently. Wounds treated without cruelty. The simple, revolutionary act of being seen as a person rather than a unit of ideology. In the years after the war, Greta Hoffmann, who would eventually change her name, moved to Argentina, marry a man who never wore a uniform, and have 3 daughters to whom she rarely spoke about these years, would sometimes think about that spring in American custody. She would remember the fear that preceded it, The propaganda that had promised liberation would mean brutality. She would remember the cognitive dissonance of finding not brutality but bureaucracy, not cruelty but indifference mixed with occasional compassion. She would remember Lieutenant Whitmore's hands, gentle and efficient, wrapping clean bandages around wounds both visible and concealed. And she would remember the tin cup dot in the architecture of memory. We build monuments to the moments that reshape us. Sometimes those monuments are grand, the fall of Berlin, the raising of flags, the signing of surrenders. Sometimes they are small. A nurse's careful hands. A consistent meal. The absence of the violence you were told to expect. The revelation that the monsters in your nightmares wore the same uniform you did. The hidden wound that stunned Lieutenant Whitmore that March day was not the shrapnel. Shrapnel she understood. Shrapnel was the expected currency of war, the mechanical transaction between artillery shells and human flesh. The hidden wound was the betrayal, the discovery that the protection promised by the uniform, by the ideology, by the 1,000-year Reich that would never come, was a fiction. The real enemy had been inside the wire all along. This was the lesson that totalitarianism eventually teaches all its true believers, that the system is built not to protect you but to use you. And when you cease to be useful, the protection evaporates like fog under sunlight. The Americans didn't need to launch a psychological warfare campaign to communicate this. They simply had to provide the basics: food, shelter, medical care, and let the contrast speak for itself. By summer, the POW camps began to empty as prisoners were processed, denazified, and released into a shattered Germany that barely resembled the nation they had fought to defend. Many would spend years rebuilding, physically and psychologically. Some would never fully reconcile with what they had participated in, what they had believed, what they had lost. The machinery of coming to terms with complicity is slower and more painful than the machinery of war. But in the quiet moments, in the privacy of memory, some would return to a specific instant, the moment when everything they'd been told collided with everything they could see, and the lies finally shattered. For Greta, it was the moment an American nurse gently lifted a blanket to treat a wound and discovered another wound beneath it. And instead of recoiling or exploiting or ignoring, simply documented it, treated it as real, bore witness to it. That was abundance too. Not material abundance, though that mattered, but the abundance of a system that could afford to see individuals as individuals, even enemy individuals, even when it would have been easier not to look. The abundance, the battles and strategies that fill official histories, but the small, decisive moments when individual human beings choose whether to see each other or look away. That March day in the Rhineland, Lieutenant Margaret Whitmore chose to see. And in seeing, in documenting, in treating what others might have ignored, she became part of a story that transcended military victory or defeat, because in the end, the most devastating weapon deployed against totalitarianism was not the bomb or the tank or the fighter plane. It was the simple, revolutionary act of human decency offered consistently, without fanfare, backed by the industrial capacity to make such decency sustainable. The Reich had promised that might made right, that strength justified everything, that the weak deserved only subjugation. And then it collapsed, and its believers found themselves weak. And the victors treated them with a humanity that made a mockery of everything they'd been taught. That was the wound that could not heal with bandages and time. That was the wound that had to be carried forward into a new world, where old certainties lay in ruins and the only way forward was to build something different from the rubble. The skirt was lifted. The hidden wound was seen. And in that seeing, something shifted, not in history, which would record the moment in a medical report filed in a forgotten archive, but in one young woman's understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where humanity had become a revolutionary act. This is what war teaches. When we are willing to learn it, that the sense of a culture that, for all its flaws and contradictions, had enshrined in its founding documents the radical notion that dignity was inherent, not granted by the state. The Reich had promised glory and delivered only ash. America, the enemy, had made no promises at all, and yet delivered something resembling mercy. This is what the tin cup represented, the evidence that dismantled an ideology. You cannot drink propaganda. You cannot treat wounds with slogans. In the end, the material world asserts itself, and all the grand narratives must negotiate with the stubborn facts of logistics, food production, industrial capacity, and the basic human needs that ideology pretends to transcend, but never does. 70 years later, in a small apartment in Buenos Aires, an old woman would occasionally tell her granddaughters fragments of a story. She would not tell them everything; some truths remained too heavy to pass down intact. But she would tell them about a spring when she was very young, when everything she believed collapsed, and she learned that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected hands. She would tell them about a nurse whose name she never forgot, though they never saw each other again. She would tell them about a tin cup and hot coffee, and the strange grace of being treated like a human being by people who had every reason not to. And she would end with this: I learned that freedom is not an idea. It is a practice. It is what they do when they don't have to, when you have no power, when you cannot demand it. That is when you see what a people truly are. The hidden wound beneath the skirt was real, but so was the hand that treated it. In the space between those two truths lives the whole complicated legacy of war. Not just smallest kindnesses matter most when everything else has been destroyed. That a tin cup of bitter coffee can contain more truth than 1,000 propaganda speeches. That sometimes the enemy you fear reveals the enemy you never suspected. And that in the midst of unimaginable cruelty, ordinary decency becomes extraordinary, not because it is rare in human nature, but because it is rare in the systems we build, the ideologies we serve, the machineries of violence we unleash and then cannot control. March 1945. Somewhere in the Rhineland, a nurse treats a wound. And in that moment, without knowing it, she becomes part of a testimony that will outlast all the monuments and memorials, all the official histories and strategic analyses, all the grand narratives about democracy and freedom. She becomes a witness to the simple truth that liberation is not just the absence of tyranny, but the presence of humanity offered person to person, wound to wound, in the ruins of certainty, under the indifferent spring rain.